baking cakes, and a road trip to the beach. It's coming up on the Teaching Literacy Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Teaching Literacy Podcast. I am your host, Jake Downs, with Patrick Wells on the back end production. This is a show where we work to bridge literacy research into practice, and I am very glad to have you with us for this episode. If this is your first time with the show and you enjoy the episode, I would appreciate you leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you receive this content. That will help others find the show. And if this isn't your first episode and you've been around a while, we'd appreciate it if you shared this episode with a friend or colleague that you feel may benefit. If you feel so inclined, we would also love a small donation to help keep the show running. A couple bucks goes a long way to help with operating costs. You can go to teachingliteracypodcast.com, click on About Your Host, and there is a link to donate securely via PayPal. I am absolutely thrilled to have two previous guests join me again. We are talking with Dr. Margaret Vaughn and Dr. Seth Parsons about their new book entitled Accelerating Learning Recovery for All Students: Core Principles for Getting Literacy Growth Back on Track. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I thought it was a great addition to my library. And as you'll see, Dr. Vaughn and Dr. Parsons have a really great perspective on things like developing a school action plan and developing teams within a school to help support student learning and partnering with communities. So if this episode resonates with you, I recommend finding the book and grabbing a copy of it. Also, if you like this episode, you'll also want to check out previous episodes I've done with Dr. Vaughn and Dr. Parsons. Seth Parsons I had on the show on episode 24. We talked about their Principles of Effective Literacy book, which is an excellent edited volume, very teacher-friendly. I have one on the shelf behind me that I refer to frequently. And Dr. Vaughn I've had on the show several times. Episode 31, we talked about teacher visioning. Episode 9, we talked about student agency. And episode 8, we talked about adaptive teaching. So both have been friends of the show pretty much since its inception, and very glad to have them on the show with us today. If you listen to those episodes, you'll notice that some of the previous themes are also present within what we talk about today as well. I hope you enjoy the conversation I had with Dr. Vaughn and Dr. Parsons, and make sure afterward to stick around for Jake's take on the topic. Dr. Margaret Vaughn and Dr. Seth Parsons, welcome to the Teaching Literacy Podcast.
Thank you.
So I've had both of you on the show before, several times. I think between both of you, perhaps 4 episodes. So you're becoming frequent flyers on the show, which is a great thing because you have so much to contribute. Today we're talking about your recently released book. It's entitled Accelerating Learning Recovery for All Students: Core Principles for Getting Literacy Growth Back on Track, and that's published through Guilford Press. So before we jump into the book, can you provide a brief overview of who you are, where you're at, and perhaps a sketch of a recent project that folks might
I'm
be
Margaret
interested
Vaughn. I'm at Washington State University. I'm a professor there, and that's over in Pullman, Washington State. And so thanks again for having us on. And a recent project that I've been working on is focused on student agency. And so I've been working with some international colleagues, and we've been trying to validate an instrument for agency there. And that's in, I guess, Italy and Norway and Ireland and some other places. We're just trying to capture that in the work we're doing.
Hello, I'm Seth Parsons, and I'm a professor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. A recent project I'm working on is actually similar, Margaret, but I'm just finished validating the writing engagement scale, which is for elementary students. We're hoping to test it outside elementary school, but initially we tested it in the elementary schools, and through multiple rounds of administration, we have a scale that is easy to administer. It's only 16 items and gives really strong, valid, and reliable outcomes. So that's exciting. It was recently accepted for publication in the Reading Teacher. And we look forward to using it moving forward. So we
That's
have a
great.
scale now that measures student writing engagement.
I love a good scale, and it's exciting to see that you're both working with scales as a way to understand how students are experiencing instruction and aspects of literacy. So jumping into the book, I appreciate the way that you introduce the entire book. Is you talk about how before you started writing the book, you decided to engage with various educational stakeholders, so folks like principals and teachers, and you just asked, what do you need? What are you struggling with? What are you trying to tackle? What are you wrestling with? Can you elaborate on the insights that you gathered from them about supporting literacy learning in
Well,
schools
I'll
today?
start off with that one, different boards and, I live kind of in a relatively small. I run into principals all the time. I have tons of teacher friends, and I think also Seth and I talk quite a bit about maybe your experiences, Seth, as well. And so, just kind of conversationally, just kind of feeling back from the pandemic, like, what do you all need? Like what we used before needs. And so, just over time and time again, just through informal conversations or in some of the boards that I'm on, people just sort of said, listen, we just need a different approach. We just need something that's not business as usual. We need to really rethink kind of what we're doing and how we're doing this. And so, really became just honestly, Jake, just very conversational with people in and out. And I emailed a couple colleagues at different places and said, "What's going on? Like, what do you think you need right now?" So, I think it's just that relational work and building those partnerships over time that I feel like very fortunate to have.
Well, this actually happened subsequent to publishing the book, but we have a new dean, and she has been very intentional about engaging local school districts. We live in a heavily populated area, so we have these humongous school districts with uh, like 20,000 teachers in one school district and serving 200,000 kids, and it's just these enormous school districts. So she has brought in um, each of the local districts surrounding this, like ten school districts. And she's brought in the leaders, the superintendents, the instructional leaders, folks from HR, just to have a mutual conversation about setting up research practice partnerships. Let's be intentional about this. We are uh, a large university, a research university in your area, and we don't have any established MOUs other than these pockets. Like there's nothing broad with the College of Education and Fairfax County, for example. Um, so she's been very intentional about doing that. And unsurprisingly, when we have these conversations about what are the most pressing issues today, literacy, especially early literacy, struggling readers, teaching reading to non-native English speakers, the science of reading phenomenon that's taking place, those have risen to the top, along with other major pressing issues like the teacher shortage and funding and dropout rates in high school, because these superintendents and central office folks have this bird's eye view across the whole school system. But literacy is definitely an arm. It is going to be the focus of later this month. Our next one's the late September. But they've asked me to give some remarks to just talk through like what George Mason has to offer and what George Mason literacy scholars um, would recommend for them in this sort of pivotal moment with literacy.
I agree. It does feel that we're experiencing a moment in literacy and literacy instruction, and I think the list that you just provided, Seth, is, if we went back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, all of those things would probably still have made the list to one degree or another, but it feels a little different right now. Things feel more dynamic, and similarly, a lot of the things that we're planning to talk about on the show are I think they're things that folks have heard before, things like MTSS, things like collaboration, things like intervention. But what I really appreciate about the text that you both wrote is you provide a little bit of a fresh take on it, but also a very human, very practical approach to, well, how do we create a vision around what we want our students to attain, and what do we believe about our students? And that fresh take, I think that's a good response to the dynamics of the situation. So let's transition to talking a little bit about the book. You open the book also with talking about a cake analogy, and you use that to describe improving literacy achievement for a school or school reform. Can you elaborate how the involvement of administrators, teachers, families, and communities is analogous to the ingredients in a cake that can
Well,
help
so
schools
Dr.
succeed?
Anthony Burke, he came up with the cake analogy, and so we cite him in the text. And so it's really pivotal. Like just even last weekend, I was actually trying to make a cake, and of course, I was doing a bunch of different other things, and so I inadvertently didn't add enough butter, and so the cake didn't do what it was supposed to do. It didn't rise. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. So much like with school reform, Dr. Burke talked about how it's just like that, right? And so we can think about school reform in that way of baking a cake. So if we don't have the eggs, for example, or in my case, the butter, right? If we don't have the necessary partners to the table, it's not going to rise or it's not going to quite work. And so I love that analogy because it makes so much sense. And, I think if we can kind of, like you said earlier, like if we think about this in a practical sense, we need to look at who the partners are. We need to look at the mix. We need to make sure all ingredients are there, all people are there, all components are there. And we need to make sure we have the right temperature, we have the right tools, the right structures. And I love that imagery of how it can really connect with what the work that we do in schools. Because, you can, it's just like teaching and the work Seth and I have talked about with adaptive teaching. And, you know, you don't necessarily see all of the work behind the scenes. And so I think, when you have that delicious piece of chocolate cake, right, you don't think necessarily about the butter or the eggs or, what all the components that you need, but they all are necessary in order to produce that kind of final, deliciousness.
And just to build upon that analogy, when the analogy is applied to
Oh,
schools,
yeah.
the recipe changes. So the recipe for baking a cake in Idaho is going to be different than the recipe for baking a cake in Fairfax, and that's something that I think has served me and Margaret well. We've been writing together since 2008, 2009, when we were still in the doctoral program together. So here we are, nearly 2 decades of collaborating, and she started her career in Idaho and now in Washington State, right next door. But the Pacific
Yeah.
Northwest is far different from the East Coast, and I started my career at George Mason University, where I still am. So we've lived in these different locations. Um, for many, many years, and we've collaborated and collected data and done similar studies where we collect same data in different locations and the populations we serve. And Margaret's done this wonderful work with American Indians and local tribes, tribal schools in her area. And then I've worked with schools in inner city DC and uh, high English language populations in Fairfax, Virginia. But that has demonstrated to us that there is a lot of overlap. There are these principles that we always return to in our books that do span locations,
Yeah.
but we can't use the exact same recipe with different kids, different cultures, different schools, different histories. Uh, we have to be responsive to the place, to the cultures of the students we serve. So if we were to
I
expand that
love
even
that.
further, I think that's how I would say it is, yeah, you got multiple pieces in the recipe, but the recipe uh, changes based upon the location and the context and
And I
the
love that too,
population
Seth,
you're
when we
working
think about just the richness, not to toot our own horns, but I love the richness across the work that we've done because I think you're right. It really connects to the specific, unique, contextualized variables in our communities and how I really appreciate that as just a colleague and a friend, and as a writing partner as well. It's such a great way to think about the work but what it means, it really stretches me as a writer to think, yeah, this may work here, but it's not going to work everywhere. And so, how do you really think even further when you think about reform and you think about how does it, in Moscow, Idaho, might not work in another community? And so, I love that about and this in the book that we really emphasize that contextualize like racial, linguistic identities in the communities in which teachers and schools are in. I think sometimes that can get overlooked in school reform. And I really love that you made that deep connection because I just think that's so essential and it's a critical component.
I would add that I feel that's a theme that is pulling from other works that you've both done. So for example, Dr. Parsons, I interviewed you about the Principle of Effective Literacy Instruction book that you both were co-editors on a couple years ago. And Nell Duke in the foreword, she talks about great instruction being like a chef. And I'll just read the paragraph here real quick. But she says, consider a great chef. Their work is more than just the ingredients they select or the technique they use to whisk the batter. It's also the way they put those together, the timing, the coordination, and the respect for each component of the process. Similarly, great elementary literacy instruction is not just about what we teach or the techniques we use to teach it. It's also about the timing, the coordination, and the respect for students that underlies it. And so, that book was very much about what do you do in a classroom? That was teachers with students. And I think any teacher listening to this podcast will understand that analogy of the chef very, very clearly. You can't put the eggs into a cake after you've pulled it out of the oven, right? Those things have to work together. And I see this book as taking, that principle of being adaptive and responsive to the living, breathing students right here in front of me. But how do we scale that at a school level? How do we, as a faculty of colleagues, how do we align our resources to support all of our students that are in our care at our school? And that adaptive component is huge. There's principles always at play, and but we have to mold and adapt and shave and craft those principles to fit within our specific context. And so to open up the book, you introduce this cake analogy, and then you start talking very, very big and very broad of developing a school action plan. And so, with the development of a school wide action plan to accelerate learning, what are the specific steps that schools can take to generate this plan? And perhaps first, maybe why does a school action plan matter? And then, what steps can schools take to create an action plan?
So goes back to my own experiences, right? It's kind of like a roadmap, the GPS, right? If you don't have that, you're never going to get to where you need to go, right? And so having that action plan really centers and makes sure all voices in the curricular process and the reform process, but it also helps to guide schools and what they're trying. So that's kind of the initial. It's you don't have a roadmap if you don't have an action plan. How are you really going to get where you need to get going? And so, one of the things that we really recommend at first is for schools to do just an organizational overview and to be honest in that attempt, right? Like, okay, what's the budget? You know, what's actually need do we need in this context with in those specific contexts, right? So, like Seth was sharing, what's needed here is it going to need even within schools, right? Or even within districts there's different needs within districts, there's different needs across the state. So if, state legislators or state people are looking at reform, we have to look at those individual needs. So review the budget. And then we thought about how you have to review resources, even down next to the classroom level. So for instance, if you really want to expand reading and reading motivation and reading engagement, do kids have high interest texts? Do they have culturally responsive texts, right? What are libraries like? So you have to do that inventory. And then focus on collaboration and research, just like Seth and I do with any project we ever embark on is you talk, you email, you talk some more, and then you even talk even more. And so you just have to really kind of do that work before you even sit down to try to get the plan started. That's what we really highly recommend. And then the first thing the actual step that we outline in the book is then developing visions. And so, we're big fans on visioning that comes from Jerry Duffy's work. He's our mentor in so many ways, a friend and a great colleague. And so this idea about visioning, and I think, Jake, we've had other podcasts on that. Seth and I worked on a lit review and some other work on that as well that we talked about. And so you need to develop a vision, right? A school-wide vision action plan with all the stakeholders. So it's not just me, myself, and I, and what it is that I want to accomplish in this school. It's reflective of all and the community. I think sometimes the community can be overlooked in that way. So we want to make sure that we invite that. So it's a step one, developing visions. Step two, you have to determining and addressing students' needs through goal setting, monitoring, and assessing. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, so on the first level, the school-wide goals. So for instance, look at the school-wide goals. If you're trying to build a more kind of inclusive culture in your school, make more time for school-wide SEL strategies or look across. You want to set school-wide goals. Then you want to go to the teacher and the grade level. How are assessments used? What are teachers' perspectives on assessment? And I believe we talk about it in this book, but I'll never forget my own experience as a classroom teacher where I had a principal and I think of course, she meant well. She wanted to do what's best for kids. But, she implemented some ideas that had teacher input. The idea was to do some of these practices, and it wasn't authentic. It wasn't connected to what we as teachers knew about our kids and our context. And so I think with good intentions, sometimes that teacher and grade level goals can be imposed on teachers. And we want to make sure we include their voices because they know they're they're right there with students. That's important. And then we also want to, and really focus deeply on student goals. So if you want to incorporate or work on reading achievement, break it down to what does that look like? Maybe that is improving and building upon students' reading stamina, for example. How do you get kids to read more books that are high interest, culturally relevant? How do we engage that? So, step two, we got that, right? Step three is the authentic learning experiences. So, this connects to what are they doing? Is it authentic? Do they have any agency? Do they have choice in what they're doing? So, it can be from dude-based learning that's connected, but you have to have students' interest. It has to be authentic. Step four, engaging teachers in critical reflection. And so, I know Seth and I have written about that. Well, such deep reflection can occur and deep change can happen when teachers reflect and they provide their voice and they make changes and they alter what they're doing in the context of the action plan that we're thinking about. And then broadening literacy learning, we put that as the last step, step five. And so really thinking deeply about not just yourself in a classroom or not just even one school, it's to think about the district. So how can you look district wide at literacy initiatives? How can you think about school reform, not just your school, but across the district or a neighboring district? What are they doing that can help to inform what it is you're doing? It's to have those partnerships, have those talking conversations that, you know, looks at the interdisciplinariness of schools and also community efforts. And then just that adaptive back and assessing and like reevaluating. And, it's kind of that circular process of making sure that you are going back, student goals in September, be the same in March, right? And to keep it so, and I think sometimes that's a key ingredient, right? We think about how we great, I've been in these meetings, even in higher ed, right? With great plans, like we're going to go great in September, and then we put that on the shelf and it's never to be looked at again till the end of the year where we say, "Oh, we didn't do what we were supposed to do." Well, part of it's possibly because you left it on the shelf. And so it's making it kind of a working, livable, readable document that you go back and you kind of reassess and reevaluate. And, it's not something that should be put up. It should be messy. It should have, you know, um, corners computer, right? You want to have lots of revision to it.
And that is a lot of hard work, and that takes considerable investment from, I think the administration are the folks that are going to be able to align the time and the resources to be able to do that work, but by including teachers, you get a much better output on the other side. Dr. Jim Knight, who does a lot with instructional coaching, I really like his work, but he talks about teachers need to have a voice, teachers need to have choice. And um, I think we've all seen the meetings where there's an initiative in September that gets sat on the shelf, and then time goes on, and that's one of the very challenging thing about working in schools is these things are happening parallel. It's not that things can stop and pause while everyone can rally around and spend a month working on a school-wide action plan. The airplane is being built while it's flying, and it takes finding slivers of time on a Friday afternoon or before school to pull the faculty together and to keep working on it. But going back to, what you talked about with visioning, I think that's where the bigger picture is able to come, and we can that's when the work becomes really meaningful because we're progressing towards something together and not just an objective that someone put up on a wall of this is what we're going to do. So a key facet of this of that kind of envelops these steps that you just outlined was implementing adaptive structures within the school action plan. So rather than focusing on specific programs, you're advocating for adaptive systematic structures. Can you explain how something that's adaptive can contribute to effective literacy learning outcomes?
So, we've been fortunate to be published on that for several years now, and that stems back from our work with Jerry Duffy and in our doctoral work. And of this idea of right, how do you adapt? And Seth mentioned it in the intro there. How do you adapt for the specific students right in front of you? And it's the same applies with school reform. How do you adapt for the specific population in which you're working with that changes monthly, changes daily, right? And so I think the adaptive structure idea is to think about um, the need for flexibility in your approach. So, for instance, the science happening across the right now. And so right. How do you carefully and adaptively use what we know about effective literacy instruction to implement those core elements of the science of reading, right? And so we advocate throughout the book and throughout our work that one program is never going to reach anybody, everyone, right? Just doesn't work that way. If we could, the person that won would be a good, gazillionaire. And so need to be really thoughtful and flexible and adaptive with programming, with curricula, with teaching strategies. You have to have that flexibility that throughout your approach when you're thinking about form and also how that's going to fit specific kids in the population, the linguistic abilities, and with the students who you're working with.
The U.S. population of school-aged children is shifting so dramatically that research findings from 30 years ago may not be as applicable to today's population as it was the population that was assessed back then. So um, the shifting demographics and the growing diversity in the United States is a beautiful thing that is enriching uh, who we are and who schools are and what our country looks like and acts like and values. And there's some real strength to that. And we need to make sure that our instruction, our literacy instruction, especially, is responsive to the students we're serving and does follow research based practice. We are learning continuously through ongoing, repeated, rigorous research, and that should be applied to practice. So I am 100% a fan of using scientific research to guide instruction, but we also need to be aware of who our students are and what types of instruction work at what points in development with which students. So instead of being tied to one particular approach, we need to be tied to supporting the children in front of us. And that may take a multitude of approaches um, that we can learn from existing research, but it can't be a lockstep. Kids are just far too different from one another generally, and with the shifting cultures and linguistic backgrounds that we have in our schools today, we can't have a cookie cutter, one size fits all.
I spend a lot of time thinking about curriculum and its role in instruction and student outcomes. And my thinking has shifted and changed, and I'm sure will continue to. But something I've thought about a lot very recently is everybody's already picking and choosing which parts of the curriculum make it into instruction and which parts are being left out. I think that's a universal facet. And in that aspect, well, if everyone's already to a degree picking and choosing the things that make it to showtime, then it's worth giving teachers a bit more ownership over that and PLC teams ownership over that to be responsive. Right now, I'm thinking that's the the sweet spot of curriculum is being able to take the curriculum and adapt it. Is it's kind of the Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, but the porridge is just right to be able to meet my students' needs. And I think that's really powerful. And I think more conversation around effective implementation of curriculum and adaptation could be a very powerful counterpart to the current science of reading conversation that's happening. So shifting from curriculum to assessment I think is always a big topic of conversation. And typically states will have assessments that they're requiring at their level, and then perhaps a district wants to have an additional assessment for this, that, or the other. And then perhaps there's a school or a PLC. And so by the time you get all the way down to the classroom level, sometimes teachers just feel tested out, that there's a lot of assessment going on. Let's talk for a minute about the process of what you advocate for, which is conducting an assessment inventory to determine what students are being assessed on and why that matters.
Sure. So, one principle of effective literacy instruction that we've highlighted in our previous book on principles, and then that is woven throughout this book, Accelerated Learning Recovery, is the idea of assessment based instruction. If we're going to be responsive, if we're going to be adaptive, if we're going to um, focus our instruction on the students in front of us, we need to know what it is they know. And we also have abundant research on early intervention, that if we can catch struggling readers early and give them the piece of that recipe, to return to our analogy, that they are lacking, that prevents them from making the progress in reading they need, then we know that we're going to serve them a lot better than kicking the can down the road and not identifying what it is that's the gap or the barrier for that particular child or that particular set of children. So assessment is absolutely vital. And I think having that robust data, knowing about early intervention, at times we've gone overboard with the screeners and the assessments. And that's where you hear from kindergarten teachers 2 months into school saying, I haven't done anything but assess my little 5-year-olds. Part of me is like, well, no, why? Like if we know that they come to school without these skills, they're already starting behind. So let's find out what they know and don't know immediately. So we have that sort of situation. And then in my professional development work with schools, working large, like macro approach, looking at states, or I've worked with a state that's working with 120 schools, trying to help these particular schools. And then working with a county, looking at these 20 elementary schools. Um, we go back to this principle of assessment-based instruction, but there's no real understanding of what takes place within one building. So that's been something that I've recommended for this sort of school-wide approach is, let's get a handle of what assessments, what screeners, what progress monitoring is taking place in the name of literacy, and what skills are being assessed and what's being overlooked. Because another thing that it's been a pattern so far in this half-hour conversation we've been having is that we're talking about a multi-dimensional set of skills that it takes to be a successful reader. So, the Scarborough's rope, which is everywhere currently with the science of reading, shows those multiple components. Or if we look at Nell Duke and Kelly Cartwright's active view, you got 4 boxes with half a dozen things in each box that these 5 and 6-year-olds have to coordinate to learn how to read. So if one of those is missing, or one of those is weak, or one of those is not being assessed and therefore not being addressed, then students are slipping between the cracks. So one step to avoid over assessment, and also to make sure you don't have gaps in your assessment protocols. I think it's a good idea to let's just collate, like let's collect and accumulate all the assessments that are given, not the informal assessments, not the kid watching, not the daily conversations, not even the unit tests. I want to see what are the screeners, what are the quarterly benchmarks, what are the progress monitoring, what's in place for the, we're talking about intervention and MTSS here shortly. But what assessments drive those decisions? But let's get them all on the table and then unpack them and see what skills, what at the end of that assessment, when you've done you've done the reviewing, you've done the grading, evaluating, what do you get? What does it tell you? Does it tell you about word recognition? Does it tell you about phonological understanding? Does it tell you about comprehension, vocabulary, fluency? And are those valid and reliable measures? I know oftentimes folks have used rate as a proxy for comprehension, and reading rate doesn't tell you anything about comprehension. So making sure that what is measured is actually measured. And are you assessing everything? So I think it's just a good idea. I don't have any one particular progress, and in thinking about what this might look like in implementation, I think it would be a good idea to start with grade level teams, because I think then the grade level teams could work together and they could do their own sort of in-house assessment inventory. And that would be a good exercise for a grade level. And then bringing that all together at like a leadership team, distributed collaborative leadership is another one of our principles presented in this book. Getting together a leadership team of coaches, literacy leaders, uh, and department chair sorts of things, and bringing them together and then looking across what the grade levels delivered and see, okay, if we're looking at a school and we have all these assessments, are we assessing our kids too much? And what are we assessing too much? What are we assessing too little? And then from that self-assessment, you can then plan a efficient, focused, targeted assessment plan across the grade level, um, to make sure that it's comprehensively studying comprehensive gathering what kids know and don't know, so we can provide highly effective
I love
instruction.
that, Seth. I mean, and I want to build on the analogy again of cooking, but it's like trimming the fat too and figuring out what do we not need. I mean, how many times, I've done so many observations where there'll be an assessment, a pre-assessment, and then it's the same idea. They do a post-assessment and it's just put aside. And so teachers don't even have the time or the bandwidth to do those weekly assessments, to review them and then plan again for the next Monday. And so do we really need that many assessments, right? Do we need those weekly assessments that are looking at those individual skills? Maybe for some students, yes, that's important. But and I think that's a key ingredient of a key component of doing that assessment inventory is figuring out what you don't need as well as what you do need. Because sometimes too much is too much.
Yeah, assessment's so tricky to wrestle with because there are hard decisions that sometimes need to be made. And the risk of overassessment is you're pushing out instructional time. There's an economy of instructional minutes, and that's very precious. And so if you're spent assessing learning, you're not instructing, you're not teaching, you're not supporting learning. And if an assessment is being delivered and like you mentioned, Margaret, of watching an assessment, every Friday we're doing the assessment. Well, if you do an assessment every Friday for your whole year, that's 20% of your instructional time gone. And so if that assessment isn't being used to drive instruction, then I would argue and say, what is its purpose then if it's not being used to form instruction? And that's where hard conversations, can happen. But in the end, sort of the approach I've taken is there's no summative assessment, even the quote unquote summative assessment at the end of the year or whatever, that still should be used to drive instruction. And so I would advocate for as you're making an assessment inventory, the flip side of that is a really clear understanding of what do we do with these data to support future instruction, to be adaptive. Because if that can't be clearly articulated, then that assessment can't be effectively utilized to benefit your students. So, and that's tricky. Like Dr. Parsons mentioned, there's a lot of strands of Scarborough's rope, where you take a look at the active view, or there's lots of different models out there. But trying to really cover those it very concretely, it does get tricky. And so this is where I think teams and schools and districts really need to have their A game on, so that way we can maximize our instructional time to accelerate learning for all students. Seth, you already hinted at this, but a key component to all of this is having a team of teams or shared leadership within the school-wide initiative. So can you suggest perhaps some key teams to establish within a school, what their respective focuses might be, and then different ideas of compositions for these teams that are working to implement the school action plan?
And that's real hard. I mean, it's difficult, and a lot of these questions are, um, because the answer is it depends. It really depends on the school makeup, the school composition. Like I worked in Title I schools where they had not a surplus, but a good number of coaches and support staff that they got through Title I funds. So there's a math coach, there's an instructional coach, there's 2 reading specialists, there's a reading coach, and then, I've worked at a school that was, high needs, but not, didn't hit that Title I threshold, that did not have the same funding for extra personnel that the other school did, in spite of, some real needs with about half the school. So what a leadership team might look like is going to vary and be very idiosyncratic to particular schools. But I do think that any leadership team should include the principal. You got to have the head, the leader of the school, but it should also be represented by teachers and then have representatives in that leadership area. You want to make sure that you have teacher leaders, those who are going to be the next generation of instructional coaches and administrators, um, and just exceptional teachers that have so much knowledge to offer. But then you also need the coaches and the administrators that take that bird's eye view instead of just that myopic classroom view. And I'll turn it over to Margaret to elaborate on this idea of
So yeah, in the
teams and
text
different composition.
I outlined like how to develop a literacy leadership team. That's like the core of this, central to kind of connecting all of these different individuals, right? So you want to have a literacy leadership team at the school. Okay. And so within that, you have teacher leadership networks, right? Those are what, Dr. Bean talks of professional capacity. And so it's this network of teacher leaders that develop that pedagogical knowledge. And they're given that space and that flexibility to develop as a community of learners. So you want to have that teacher leadership network as part of that overriding literacy leadership team. Then you want to have literacy coaches, right? That Seth just referred to, right? You also want to have assessment teams. So looking at the inventory, what do we need? What do we not need? How can we be more flexible? Do we really need to do this every week? Could we pare this down so that there is that more instructional time that we can give to students? And then we talk a lot in the book about how developing like a curriculum adoption team. And so to, especially right now with the culture and what's happening across schools, we really want to make sure that we have multiple constituents at the table when it comes to adopting curriculum, right? It's so vital. We really want to make sure we have community members. We want to have a diversity bandwidth of a variety of stakeholders when we're thinking about curriculum. And then we also kind of advocate in the text in this chapter for this idea of accelerated learning teams. And so to me, this is a new idea when I was doing research for this particular part is and it's so intuitive, which is why I love it. Right. Um, and it's so practice oriented. It's so real life what you do anyway as an individual. So accelerated learning teams looks at not just within the school, but and the neighboring school, social media, right? How can I build this accelerated learning team that focuses, let's say, on a problem? So, like maybe you have a K-2 learning team in the district or at the state or however you want to look at that, focusing in on a specific area, specific problem of practice that you want to go deeper in. It could be around not just with who are students who might be, quote unquote struggling, but maybe students who are or accelerating. And how do we meet those specific needs of the populations of the students that you have in front of them? So thinking about learning teams a little bit more broadly to connect, it's not just a grade level. We want to think across grade level, across schools. So maybe it's a third, fourth, fifth team to look at the ins and outs, what's happening in third that can inform fourth and so on. How can you think about that? So I think sometimes we could be siloed, right, as teachers and even as researchers, right? We can kind of get in our lane and just do what we need to do, but having that also flexibility and that flexible approach to our thinking with reform and developing collective visions across grade levels. So I think that that's a really critical component that we can get lost in because we want to have that grade level time, right? We sit down and we focus, we just look at our grade level because that's enough. And I agree that's enough. But we also want to make sure that we don't add this on as another add on for teachers. We want to provide time. We provide resource, I'm sure all of us have been in districts where they hire a lot of, they hire some outside constituent to come in and do this. Like, I'm sure it's awesome, like an awesome one day, but it costs thousands and thousands of dollars. And all I can think of, wow, we have so many talented teachers, principals, and leaders in our own community or alumni, right, that we could invite them to come and be, you know, leading us, be a heck of a lot more authentic, right? And I think the idea of raising up the voices of teachers is so vital right now as we experience a teacher shortage. But teachers shouldn't do it for free, right? I think districts, if you can spend that much money on outside, you can spend that much money in-house. And so I really advocate for that, as a vital, as central, as important to this book and also reform is that we really want to make sure we don't just do an add-on also for administrators. We want to make sure we provide the time, the money, and the resources to make this successful. Or, back with the cake, right? It's not going to rise. It's not going to work.
think that's fantastic in thinking about groups of teams of teams working together within a school and that idea of shared leadership across the school. That's where the buy-in comes on the teacher end. And there's real power in passive following versus active engagement with a process. And so when there's groups of teams working within a school, there's shared ownership, there's shared voice, and now you have folks who are wanting to work together towards the greater good, and that is time consuming, and that is time outside of a teacher's contract to be able to do that. And it's important to remember though that teamwork might be a slower process. It's a lot easier for the smart person in the room to say, "Let's do this," and to bulldoze onward. Um, but the power that a team can offer over single person trailblazing is I mean it doesn't even compare, but it might be a slower burn to get there. And so with that, this idea is runs as a thread throughout your book as well, and is very complementary to this idea of shared leadership across a school. But thinking about school community partnerships, partnering with community organizations can be a really powerful way to accelerate literacy learning. How can such collaborations enhance the educational experience? And then, what are some examples of common partnerships that you've seen?
Sure. Thank you for that question. This is something that's near and dear to my heart because it's something I've engaged in since my doctoral work, um, especially in school university partnerships, and that's something that drew me to George Mason when I was job hunting years and years ago. Was they have a professional development school model where they build authentic partnerships between the elementary education program and schools. And our faculty spend one day a week in a partner school over multiple years. So you really can build some genuine, trusting relationships uh, between a university-based teacher educator and a school-based educator, along with teacher candidates who are there to learn. And it's this triad of learners all focused on helping students learn better. So the school university partnership model, uh, through teacher residencies and professional development networks, is it's really hot in teacher ed right now, and I think appropriately so. We've for too long this gulf between colleges of ed and the K-12 schools, um, and there's been like a lack of trust. Universities have far too often used schools as like the training ground for their students instead of engaging authentically. And at the same time, it's hard for schools to trust universities because they're over there in the ivory tower and come by once in a while and tell us what to do. So if we leave that behind, we're on this together. Like we have the same goal. We're all here to help children succeed and achieve. And from our lens, and literacy achievement and support their literacy learning. But then also the communities Schools are tend to be within a local community, and there's this opportunity for schools to be a hub of the community that welcomes the local community around. So teacher, parents, family members, guardians, um, grandparents feel comfortable being at the school and welcome at the school. Because unfortunately, especially in some of these underprivileged uh, communities, people of color, school has been a place of harm historically instead of a safe place of growth and support. And we need to change that in the way we work with the local community. When I was working at a school in DC, it was a charter school. And one of our initiatives in this year long, well, multi year professional development partnership was to engage community business leaders to say, hey, if we're invested in this neighborhood, we're invested in this place, this town, um, we should invest first in the school. And we attended the business leaders of this town. They had a community business leaders meeting once a month where business leaders get together and talk about current issues in the community and what they as business leaders can do. And we went and we gave our spiel about, we're starting this new literacy initiative at this school, which is in your community, and we're seeking support and possibly tutoring opportunities after school if there's volunteers. Uh, also welcome any funds. We're trying to do a book drive so students have books at home. And their response was interesting. And they came back. I'd only been working with the school for 2 years. And they said, a decade ago, the principal used to come to this meeting every month, and we used to provide all sorts of support. But then the leadership changed, and we never heard from y'all again. And we've been here to help, but no one's come ask. And I thought that that was interesting and telling. And we sort of tucked our tails and said, "Oh, we didn't know that history." And you can bet that the principal would be at the next business leaders meeting as well. So it wasn't as simple as, "Hey, cut us a check." They did a modest check to buy some books, but it was also, "Hey, come and engage with us. Like, we want to know what's going on in that school and what we can do, but you got to meet us halfway." And that was really telling to me that the business leaders, bankers and things like that, they want to help. They want to know what's going on in their neighborhood schools right in their backyard. Um, and schools not have a responsibility, but it would behoove schools to tap into those resources because they too want the school to be successful. Parents who send their kids there want it to be successful. Even people that don't have kids there, they want to have a vibrant school that is safe. Kids are learning. It gets a good grade on the school ratings that people check out when they're house hunting. So there is this sort of holistic communal feel that can be cultivated at a school. And that supports literacy learning because you have more people invested in what's taking place in the school. And if we as educators and university teacher educators can build these sort of unilateral, there's not one that's above the other. Like, there has to be trusting, equal relationships among these various stakeholders, because I've learned in my time that there are more interested
I love
stakeholders
that,
than
Seth.
this.
I love that thinking. I think also in the book we talk about the idea too about expanded learning time. And so that was, I think it kind of really connects deeply to that. So when schools are thinking about, building those partnerships and kind of what might that look like? And I have to admit, and I'm a school advocate, a public school advocate, and I love it. But sometimes it makes me so sad when I see those tutoring experiences like in the summer or after school or before school or even during school, right? It's painful for the students, right? They are fully aware that they're, quote unquote struggling, right? So they're in that context and they're receiving the same kind of instruction that didn't work for them in the first place. And so it's a snowball effect. And so I think we want to be really intentional about what expanded learning time looks like, especially in school and out of school, and when we build those partnerships when it comes to tutoring. And in the book, we outline a bunch of quality indicators for what does effective tutoring look like. But, kind of think about the rule that I always talk with my pre-service teachers and any time I work with teachers. If you don't want to do it, it's a good chance your students don't want to do it either. And so if you're bored to tears by reading something 7 or 8 times over and over, there's a good chance your students might feel the same way. Ask them, right? And so, we talk about that, expand what that could look like. Connecting with meaningful and authentic tasks, right? Like, I with some of the local indigenous tribes that are local and specific to the Pacific Northwest, but it was wonderful to be involved in programs where it was local and specific and driven by teachers and the community. This teachers and their own dual language texts and, just I think really creative and innovative things can come out of tutoring programs that don't maybe look like the same way we've done tutoring programs in the past, right? And so meaningful and authentic, culturally and linguistically rich to those individual students in front of you communities. um, and in the book, we also sample like a weekly plan of what that might look like for an effective like summer tutoring program built around this idea about what's authentic, what's local and specific. And so I just wanted to kind of build on that idea that you know, tutoring, it can be really effective, but it can also be really harmful, right? Or ineffective, maybe not harmful, but just ineffective. And if we're going to do tutoring, we don't want to make it so that it's a lot of resources, it's a lot of personnel and so forth. And so don't throw out those ideas about what's effective with literacy instruction and be like, oh my gosh, I need to like do this tutoring program to the T and how it fits. Keep those adaptive principles in place because it needs to be motivating. It needs to be engaging. It needs to give kids a sense of agency in their work. We can shift that kind of narrative when we think about supporting kids with reading and writing and literacy. It doesn't have to be a deficit perspective, right? We can build upon what students can do instead of what they can't do. And so I think that's kind of the cornerstone of what the extended learning time should look like, expanded learning time should look like when we think about the tutoring and also community engagement.
And that sort of leads to this question that I don't know if you're going there next or not, but I'm taking us there, Jake, about the MTSS. And Margaret's talked about tutoring. And you were asking, what do you see schools doing well with MTSS and what are schools not doing so well? And the things I was thinking that we do well is I think we do a good job of identifying students that do need extra support. And I think that we do good to provide small group explicit teaching for intervention for those students that need that tier 2 additional layer of support. Those are things that through the RTIs shift into MTSS, through that understanding and ensuring that students get high quality instruction before they ever even considered for special education services has been a game changer, so to speak. But as Margaret was alluding to earlier, what we don't do so well in intervention settings is attend to students' cultural backgrounds. Very rarely do I ever see culturally relevant intervention. Oftentimes they're prepackaged and take no consideration of the students' linguistic, cultural, home lives, interests, passions. None of that is tapped. And likewise, I don't know that intervention pays much attention to motivation or engagement. With students in tier 2 instruction, there's a sense of urgency, and I love that. There needs to be a sense of urgency, but it's like we have to get students this skill now, and we need to have that, but we also need to say, how can we use what we know about effective instruction to implement this intervention? And we know that explicit teaching works, so keep the explicit teaching. But let's do it in a way that's relevant to the children and that's engaging and motivating. And Jake, I know you know Chase and good friends with him, and I think he's really masterful at this. He can take pretty dull, uh, skills that need to be taught through rote. Sometimes you just have to teach a kid how to do it. But then he goes and makes up a story about a booger or something So kids love it because then they're laughing and they're having fun because they're talking about toots and boogers. Um, but he is focusing on who those children are and how I can hook them in and then give them the skills and the practice they need. But the skills and the practice doesn't have to be with boring, dry, every day, the cat sat on the mat stuff. Let's do what makes kids giggle and roll around on the carpet with laughter. And then that can be the rhyming activity. Um, but I think that's where we're really lacking is we don't focus on motivation and engagement in those intervention settings, and we certainly don't focus on providing culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogy.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess what you're providing there, Seth, is this idea that we don't have to pick and choose between effective instruction and enjoyable instruction. And you're referencing Chase Young, and we were working on a project with students. They were doing repeated readings, and we included a poem in there, and the aliens have landed, they're here, and it goes through the aliens and how scary they are, and they're at your school is how it ends, and they all got job as teachers, and just things like that, and the students I think it's funny, I mean, it's funny, and that's, I think, a horizon of where what research could work harder to incorporate, and that's where some of the scales that you've both worked on can really be, I think, extremely valuable in helping triangulate data, but, developing intervention that, is instructionally giving, but also life and soul giving as well. And I think especially here for adolescent, upper elementary, middle school interventions where, if they've been doing intervention for year over year over year, it can be hard on everyone. And so thinking being creative there, I think really matters. And I'll comment back on the school community partnerships as well. I didn't realize that I had skipped the MTSS question. So thanks for your sharp eye, Dr. Parsons. But when I was reading the book and I started thinking back on school community partnerships that I've seen, they can play such a vital role, but it can be oftentimes a sort of background role that isn't in the front and center as flashy, but it's doing a lot of good. I was thinking, back when I was a teacher, in our school district, there was a donor, an anonymous donor within the community that worked with the school district to set up a little pantry in each school so that food scarcity wasn't something that what students would have to face. And I was able there were students I was able to access and use that with. And another example I thought of was our local library was like 3 blocks away from the school, and I was working with my students on near the end of the school year of let's get you ready for fifth grade. I want you in some really great, very fun, very enjoyable books over the summer, and we would walk over to the library and the librarian would show us around and here's how you get a library card and here's let's look at some books that are available. And the librarian there was just absolutely, thrilled, that we would bring the students over there and look through it. And there were kids that, rolled their eyes, and I've been to the library a million times, but those were the kids that needed the summer reading the least, right? So and I called it the summer six, and we would plan out 6 books that they would be able to read over the summer, and that was really powerful. And a third example I thought of a community one. This was with middle schoolers and trying to support middle school math outcomes, especially with multilingual students. And middle school math intervention, math's not in my lane, but that's a hard sell for a lot of teenagers to come in outside of school hours to work on math intervention, but they were able to partner with a community member or a community organization to do drone soccer as part of it, and I didn't even know like drone soccer is a thing, that they're like little flying drones and one of the drones is the ball, and you play soccer. And so that was able to work in tandem with being this hook to, okay, I'll go do drone soccer and I can get math in it. I can get math support as well. And just to help with that engagement piece for a population that needed extra support, to develop in math. So those school community partnerships, I think you both labeled it well in saying there's groups and organizations out there to partner with, and that it might take time to build partnerships, but those folks in the community, they're there, they're committed, they're not going anywhere, they're going to be there 10, 15 years down the road. And so it's worth building that community. We've covered so much ground, and I really would recommend folks, check out the book, because it does go a lot deeper into all of these ideas. But uh, some final guiding principles. Dr. Vaughn, in the book, you talk about a recent trip to the beach, and that provides a little analogy for us to think of some final guiding principles. Can you talk about your trip to the beach and what principles that
Oh,
allows
I
us
I
to draw
love that,
from?
and it really happened, and it was kind of funny, but it was right in writing this book that this happened, and I thought, "Wow, that's such a" it's so connected to what can happen in schools when we think about reform. And so, my family and I, we're about, I think it's about 6 or 8 hours away from the beach, and we're over in Washington, in Oregon. And so, um, it's this whole idea you can't see the forest for the trees idea. So we had everything packed, and I had everything, everything, right? Like, you know, multiple things of clothing and for all the kids, and everything was ready, all ready to go. And we're there, and we get to Cannon Beach, and I'm like, "Yes, we're there. We got this." The kids are like, "Yeah, we wanna go. We wanna, like, get in the water." And I'm like, "Great." And then, of course, what did we all forget? The swimming gear, right? And so, no goggles, no swim trunks, nothing, like, no swimsuits at all. And so, I thought that was so apropos to what can happen, right? And so, as much as you want to perhaps just focus in on extended learning time or focus deeply on tutoring, well, you can't just focus on that aspect and not do the other components that we specifically outline in the book. I mean, we spent a lot of time researching what does effective school reform look like? What doesn't work and what does work? And we tried to really hard to summarize those key principles in the book. And so, um, don't get caught out by not having your swim trunks, right? Or, make sure that you see the vision, you have the vision, you kind of reassess and regroup and kind of go back and think about it. You have all those necessary components. So you know where you're going to. You can see the forest, right? But you can also see the individual trees in front of you. You can get a pulse on teacher burnout, too much, too little, right? Do we really need to have this extended professional learning during the one day that teachers are trying to prep for doing report cards, right? So really looking at that individual and specific, right? The culture that you have in your school and with the students so that you can see what you have, right? And then also looking down the road to see what you need. So in the case of the swimming, right? And the beach trip, making sure you have what you need, making sure you have the swim gear, right, to go swimming actually when you get there. And so I just loved that idea because it just seemed to fit so well with how we think about school reform. We can get so caught up in one aspect. Kids may be struggling, or we get so focused, which rightly so. We want to build student achievement. We want to focus in on that. But if we focus too tightly on that and don't really look at the structures and the systems and the adaptability that we need to kind of make it work, we're going to lose in the end. We're not going to see where we need to go and what needs to get done. That's the connection to my beach trip, which we eventually did get our swim stuff. But it was funny when we came home. It was all neatly on the table where we had packed. So I mean, I think it goes back to the action plan, right? Like that's kind of that same idea, right? Pull it out, kind of lay it out. Don't set it away so that you're have it, neatly set aside. You want to make sure you incorporate it and kind of revisit it.
Absolutely, and I think if I would add on to anything of that, these systems and everything we've talked about that are sort of outside of instruction, they're all meant to support instruction in the same way that checking the tires and driving the hours and hours to get to the beach and paying for the fee for the beach and attaining lodging, those were not the central goal. Those were all means to an end of getting your family to the beach. And any one of these that we've talked about can go down a rabbit hole of becoming overly bureaucratic or Byzantine, and being able to serve as an end unto itself rather as a means to a different end. And that takes all of this takes work. So for folks out there that are engaged in this work, my hat is off to you. This is hard work, but it is very worthwhile work. And I appreciate both of you being willing to take time out of your schedule to come and talk with us about accelerating literacy learning. Final question before we go. What do you each see that is going well in literacy instruction right now? What's filling your cup?
I had another answer prepared, but when I you just ask it and when I think about it in that way, what's filling my cup, I think it's the teachers. I think teachers are going well right now. Teachers have been through the ringer with COVID, school shuts downs, the like societal response to that, the division, the complaints and blaming teachers, and some loving teachers more because of what they did at home, and others questioning the efficacy. Teachers have learned that, they have the perseverance to stick with it and show up every day for kids. And that is really heartening. And now we have a new sort of way um, entering schools with new initiatives, new curricula being rolled out, new standards being adopted. And I'll tell you what, teachers, they face it with smiles and energy, and they do it for the children. And I'm just amazed at what I'm seeing in classrooms today in spite of it all. So teachers, if you're listening, I thank you, and we'll keep working hard because we see you working hard, and the kids
Yeah,
are
I
working.
would echo that too. Just give the teachers and schools, they've been the consistent guiding light through the pandemic and beyond. And, fall is definitely my favorite time of the year because I get to regroup and see the magic that happens with teachers in schools, and also a shout out to principals and the literacy coaches and also the specialty teachers that maybe sometimes we can overlook easily because they're not necessarily, you know, um, part of other kinds of conversations that we want to try to include them in the work. I think just schools, public schools, I mean, it's just, I'm such a huge fan. Um, that, and I think, yeah, I mean, teachers, yeah, of course, they're our love. Like, I think that's, where we both came from, or we all came from, right? Is from teaching and the teaching profession. So I think that and the flexibility that I continue to see, um, and the grace in which and the positivity that schools. I mean, I really am in awe if I'm really honest, because it just seems like things are kind of becoming even more restrictive in some places around the country, and, I'm just in awe. That's all I can say. Yeah, so keep it up, and, we're your biggest fans.
Dr. Margaret Vaughn and Dr. Seth Parsons, thanks for joining us on the Teaching Literacy podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
A great big thanks to Dr. Margaret Vaughn and Dr. Seth Parsons for joining me on the show today. I learned so much from them, and there was just so much fantastic conversation. There was a lot of information from the book that was left on the cutting room floor that didn't make it into the conversation. So if you appreciated what we talked about, uh, grabbing a copy of the book would probably be worth your time. I have a big picture takeaway around what it takes to really improve our schools to support student learning outcomes. And my first thought is this thought of how it's ongoing work. I'm a fan of evidence based practice. I'm a student of learning more about evidence based practice. But one of the limitations of research is that it is a snapshot of a specific point in time, that any study has a time that it began, it commenced, and a time that it ended. And so sometimes what gets lost in the conversation there is how this is really a process that is intended to be ongoing, that it's not this one time we're going to make this big push for a school action plan, but it's something that, at least initially, yeah, is going to have high amounts of time to invest in. But over time, it has to be pruned and maintained and revisited over and over and over again to really maintain its viability. And if you look at the school around you, what teachers are at that school this year that weren't there last year? And do those teachers, do they have immediate buy-in to this school action plan that you and your colleagues spent blood, sweat, and tears to create? you have buy-in because you were part of that process, but your new colleagues at the school, whether they're brand new or from a different school, they don't have that. And so it has to be enveloped and them folded into the process and being able to do the same process to have a voice and a choice. And, thinking of when administration changes the building, there is turnover within schools. And even if there wasn't turnover within schools, it's important for a school to have a direction that it's headed and for it to have a clear vision of this is how we want to support our students and this is how we're going to do it. All of these other things, like Dr. Vaughn mentioned with her trip to the beach, that in the end, they serve the purpose of the beach, right? All these other things should be in service of our students. So this is an ongoing process. If your school doesn't have it, yes, it has a definite start point, but hopefully it's not this one big push, but it's small, consistent things over time that can get traction and build. And that's very hard to do. Sometimes in education, it just feels like we're getting whiplash from one direction to another direction to another direction, which makes it hard to do these things that we talked about on the show today, but it also makes what we talked about that much more important. And so that way you have a lens and a way to weigh and evaluate all the other things that are causing the whiplash back and forth. My second point of conversation, and this is really the flip side of what I just talked about, but is how hard of work this is to do. And it's time-consuming work. And one of the realities of being in the classroom is the lion's share of your time is spent in front of students, which is great. That's where we should be, is getting face time with students and instruction. However, on the back end, that means that time to keep the machine running and to improve it over time, that's often scraps of time, a half hour there, here, an hour after school there. And so it's really challenging to be able to do the level of rigor that's really required to have this be a school-wide initiative. It's very challenging to do. So my hat's off to educators who are trying to work with their colleagues and work with their school to build a better support system to make sure that our students are acquiring the literacy knowledge and skills and achievement they need to be successful in future years. I'm a fan of Revolution's podcast, and Mike Duncan's podcast. If you're a person of history, I highly recommend checking it out. But one of the characters he talks about in Revolution's podcast is Simon Bolivar, who was a revolutionary in the South American wars for independence in the early 1800s. And Simon Bolivar is purported to have said something similar to the fact of those who have served the cause of revolution plow the sea. And he just talks about how hard of work it is to do what he was doing. He likened it to plowing the sea. And sometimes that's often how we might feel as educators, that we are out there trying to plow the sea, but it's good work. It's worthwhile work. And if we do it right, it's investment that we can collaborate and make good decisions now that are going to pay dividends down the road, an initial investment of time that's going to help us down the road. That's all I have for you today. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, to leave a review, or share with a friend. We really appreciate all the listeners that are out there. Thank you for being part of this community. This is Jake with the Teaching Literacy Podcast, and until next time, let's work together to make reading and writing instruction even better.